Hi, everyone. Welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I'll be your host for today's show. So glad you're able to join us and just take some time to see all of the good things that you are making possible through your partnership with State Policy Network. Today, we'll be joined by Tracy Sharp, the CEO of State Policy Network, to give us her take on the 2020 elections. After that, we're going to talk with Matt Paprocki, who is the president of Illinois Policy Institute. And Matt's going to share a story about one of the most progressive states in our country. And I think it's going to blow your mind the way it blew mine. So get ready for that. Let's start by turning it over to Tracy. Hi, Tracy. Good to see you.
Hey, great to be here, Rebecca.
Well, Tracy, it's been a crazy couple of weeks. What surprised you most about the elections?
What surprised me? Perhaps we should ask the pollsters what surprised them the most. Uh, that this is not a progressive country yearning for socialism. Biden thought he was going to get a blue wave, but what he ended up with was what I heard one commentator describe as more like a blue trickle. So I think especially in the States, we had the least amount of turnover or change in the state legislative chambers since the elections of the 1940s. This means that there are still more red state trifectas. In fact, we picked up a couple more red state trifectas, which is very important since in January we start redistricting.
And Tracy,
So
remind those who might not know what you mean by trifecta.
right. A trifecta is where the governor and both houses of the state legislature are controlled by the same party. So I think at last count, the red states were 23 trifectas, and the blue states, the Democrats, had 15. So this gives us the upper hand in these legislatures with the hopes that we can drive more free market ideas through those entities.
Well, that's great news. So that's got to have you feeling somewhat optimistic. Were there any other trends that you saw that made you think, maybe this isn't as bad as it could have been?
Yeah, it was interesting in some states you started to see Americans are very pragmatic. See, I live in California, and here voters voted down affirmative action. They voted down a tax increase that would have really changed the very popular Prop 13 from many years ago. So it seems like there are some conservatives in this state that, or at least fiscally conservative, that are calling themselves Democrats. So I think on some of the state legislative or the state initiatives went in our favor. We're going to hear about one big win that went in our favor from our guest speaker today. So I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, so what opportunities are there now then? Because we've got the trifectas you mentioned, and you saw some good things at the ballot boxes. Uh, what are the opportunities to solve some of these big challenges Americans are facing today? I mean, what areas are you looking at?
Well, the election outcomes provided opportunities, but let's not forget, in the midst of a pandemic, what are we on, month 8 or 9 now? This has created tremendous openings. Like the Overton window has shifted, especially in K-12 education, where you have learning pods, and parents, I think especially single parents, are feeling this acutely. They're looking for ways to really bootstrap and make their own solutions to get their children educated while they can keep working. So we're going to push into K-12 education. Of course, healthcare access. We want to make a lot of the temporary reforms of March and April permanent. I mean, that increasing that access is helping really save lives. Energy opportunities, of course, let's not forget, we've got to get people back to work. And it's interesting too, and maybe this is another episode or something we could talk about later, is there may be opportunities to look at how the vote counting process is done. It's very much a function of the state and state legislatures or secretaries of state. We got to make that vote counting process reliable, accountable, and transparent. I mean, we owe it to the American people. We had a record voter turnout. We don't want that to turn to malaise. We really want to honor people and their vote. So lots of opportunity.
That's a great point about voting, Tracy, because that is in fact a state issue. So it could be a great lane for this network.
Yep.
Okay, so last question. I'm thinking about 2008, where I was so much younger and my life was so different. But it wasn't just me when Obama was elected. Our network looked very different back then. And thanks to a lot of the donors who are viewing the show today and others, this network's changed a whole lot. It's much more sophisticated. And in my opinion, we're ready for a Biden administration. How do you see us better positioned now than we were? What's changed and why are you ready to rock and roll?
I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is the dramatic growth of capacities that have been built around the state think tank as a centerpiece. So we have a state think tank, at least one in every state. It's really not enough. And those are 501c3 entities, and they're the idea, the pillar of ideas. But built around that are different advocacy and political capacities to help give their ideas teeth and traction. So I would say building out those capacities, most specifically litigation.
Mhm.
Over the last 12 years, we've now seen, I think it's a total of 16 state-based litigation centers, most of which were started by a state think tank. And just the messaging and media and owned audience capacity has been growing out significantly. And I think even in the next few years, we'll see great gains in owned audience in each of these state-based think tanks.
Can you describe what you mean by owned audience?
Sure, it's a marketing word, it's marketing parlance, which means that someone gives you their email address, right? They opt in and they say, yes, I want to get your info. I want to be challenged in calls for action. Maybe I call my legislator or my senator. So that's considered an owned audience because they want to be tapped and mobilized. And it is one way that when the media turns or is overwhelmingly on one side of the equation, it's one way where we can go directly to constituents, directly to the people and work around, do an end run around what in a lot of cases has been a propaganda machine. So I know we're going to talk more about that because we're seeing that being put into practice and bringing real results in the states.
All right, Tracy. Well, let's bring Matt Paprocki out, the president of Illinois Policy Institute, and we'll hear a little bit of some of the points you just made in action with Matt's story. Matt, hi, welcome to the show.
Hello, Rebecca. Hello, Tracy.
So glad you're here. Okay, Matt. So it goes without saying, you had a major fight on your hands in one of the most progressive states in America. What was the fight over? And tell us a little bit about your opposition, how much money they spent to win. Give us the facts.
Yeah, the fight was over moving from a flat income tax to a progressive tax in Illinois, and we slayed the dragon. And I call it a dragon because when they pass this out of the General Assembly, we have a constitutional protection for a flat tax. When they moved this out of the General Assembly in March of 2019, it had 67% favorables. And our governor pledged $50 million of his own money to completely own the narrative on the airwaves for the next 20 months. Right. And that's why I call it a dragon. I thought about this the other day because I was sitting at home with my 3-year-old daughter, Fiona, and she is an avid reader. And we were reading St. George and the Dragon. And as we were going through the book, my daughter looked up at me and she said, Dad, how come everybody else in the village is too afraid to fight the dragon? And I said, oftentimes people get told things are impossible and they get scared and they run away from them. And she said, Dad, I don't think it's impossible. Smart kid. But the point is that dragons look huge and they look like you can't beat them. But oftentimes we just accept the narrative that it's impossible and we shouldn't fight the fight. And we decided that we were going to go headfirst into this fight and attack this with everything we had. As Tracy was saying, we've built out our owned audience. Our owned audience is now 1.5 million people. That is 25% of how many people voted in the election in Illinois. So if you walk outside here on the streets of Chicago, 1 out of every 4 people you walk by has opted into our community and says, I want more information.
That's incredible. How does that compare to like the Chicago Tribune?
Chicago Tribune has about 300,000 people. We have, with the Sun Times, you have about 150,000 people. So
and you have 1.5 million?
that we communicate directly with. And so that's had a huge effect. We've also completely dominated media. We had 906 media hits in the state of Illinois. That's 4 times more than J.B. Pritzker, our governor, had on his side, 906. And that happened because we had so much policy content that was continuously coming out and pushing different angles and different research. One of the things we say here is there's no such thing as silver bullets. There's lead bullets, and we're going to continuously shoot them out. And that's exactly what our policy team did. Our government affairs team started a group of activists called the Lincoln Lobbyists, and they go knock door to door on house to house. There's 20,000 of them now in the state of Illinois. They made phone calls. They sent over 1 million text messages before the election. So this started off when we fought the dragon, and he had 90 or 67% favorables. On November 3rd, that went from 67% to being defeated with only 45% favorables.
Oh my, okay, question. So that change happened. He had over $50 million. How much money did you guys spend to slay this dragon?
Just over $1 million we spent on this campaign.
Wow, what an ROI.
It's been pretty good. I was thinking about this in this fight as it pertains to the dragon. And there's this great quote from G.K. Chesterton that I'm going to try to paraphrase here. And he says, children's literature doesn't teach us that dragons exist. Kids already know that dragons exist. What it teaches us is that dragons can be slain. And I think in Illinois, in the rest of the country, we showed on November 3rd that we don't have to be afraid, that it's not impossible, and we can still kill dragons.
You sure can. All right. So you mentioned, Tracy talked about having these, knowing you can't just have a think tank, and it helps to have the litigation center, grassroots, media, C6s, C4s, all of these different entities working together, which you just mentioned in your story definitely happened. But to pull all of that together, you guys had to have the right message to deliver, because no offense, but most normal people, sometimes myself included, I hear progressive tax and start to get a little sleepy. So how do you make this relevant to the masses in Illinois? Why should they care about that?
Yeah, so before I want to talk about details, I'd like to pull this back and talk about big picture here.
Okay.
This is the first time in Illinois history that we saw information parity. And what information parity is, it's when a buyer and a seller in an exchange have the exact same amount of information. And I thought about this 3 weeks ago. I've decided to trade in my car and we're buying a minivan because my wife and I are going to be adopting a couple of kids. And so we went to go buy a minivan, and I stepped foot on the used car dealership, and I realized this feels different than 20 years ago when I bought my first car. And 20 years ago, when I bought my first car, I walked into the lot and I remember being scared and confused. I didn't know anything about cars. I still don't, quite frankly. But I was completely at the discretion of the car salesman. He knew about the cars and which ones were reliable and which ones had accidents. And what this is called, it's called information asymmetry. It's when one party has way more information than the other party. Mm-hmm. It's why, quite frankly, that we hate used car salesmen. That's why they have a bad name. It's probably why we hate politicians as well. But when I walked into the used car dealership 3 weeks ago, I had a Carfax report. Mm-hmm. I knew who owned this car before. I knew how many times it had been to the shop, how many miles it had on it. I had a consumer report that showed this is how safe this car is going to be for your family. I knew how reliable it was going to be and how long I could trust it. I had a Kelley Blue Book that told me the exact value of this car. That's information parity. And that is what finally happened inside of the state of Illinois. Is we started talking to people when they first started their message, like a used car salesman. They said 97% of people, Rebecca, are going to get a tax decrease. This is going to solve all of our financial problems. And that's why you saw when people have information asymmetry, 67% of people supported it.
Sure.
But we started educating them on the issues. We started looking into the fact that 32 other states have a progressive income tax, and every one of those also has a retirement tax. Illinois doesn't. Ooh. Right? That is the next progressive step. We also looked into if they trusted their lawmaker and started saying, do you trust giving them a blank check to change your rates however you want them to? So this is exactly how we decided to attack this issue. We had at the polls on November 3rd, 1.1 million people changed from a yes vote to a no vote, right? That is a huge shift. And where that comes from is information parity. We're taking these lessons from the used car industry and we're saying, how do we apply this throughout our state? Now we have voter parity. Now we have information parity. That is a huge deal.
It is a huge deal.
Tracy, Rebecca, I'm fascinated by this because on the one hand, we have to have the capacities and the tools to broadly communicate this. So that's important. You can't win without it. You can't put lead on the target, right? But on the other hand, if you don't have a winning message that truly understands the heart of the electorate,
yes,
doesn't matter how much you spend or how many tools you have, you won't win. And that's why progressives could so outspend you.
Yes.
Yet you won.
Yeah.
I think Florida might learn from this too. I think those legislative races were outspent 7-1, yet Florida held those seats. So anyway, go on. This is great.
No, that's such an important idea. And I think it goes to the heart of there's no silver bullets. You know, we saw in exit surveys, 22% of people voted against the progressive tax because of the retirement tax angle that we brought up. Nobody else was talking about it. That is 600,000 votes. 33% of people on exit surveys said because they didn't trust their lawmakers, right? That is transformational differences in the voting population, but it's not one message. And that's where JB in the governor's office failed. They ran the same ad over 97%, 97 people didn't buy it at the end of the day. And that's what it was, is he tried to sell them a lemon and they finally had information and said, I don't want to buy this.
Wow. Matt, this is especially encouraging because I know in my heart of hearts, and I think that most of our viewers do too, that the states are so important no matter who's in the White House. But especially right now, more than ever, we need this network to be the antidote to everything coming out of Washington, D.C. And for you guys to have a win this big in a state like Illinois, no offense, I'm a South Carolina girl, it's huge. It just shows that the sky's the limit. So I've got to ask, all right, you've
please come to California.
What's next? I mean, what does this mean for the people of Illinois, and what do you think can come of your next big win?
Illinois is wide open. And what we saw was this was the loose brick and we punched it out. I think the blue wall is crumbling, and now it's the time that we have to start taking these other bricks and remove them one by one. We saw 2 days after the election, after the progressive tax failed, Democrat lawmakers lining up and saying, we actually need real reform. We have to reform our pension system. Democrat lawmakers in a blue state like Illinois. We had, for the first time, Senator Dick Durbin, hours after the election, said Mike Madigan needs to step down. Mike Madigan is our Speaker of the House. He is the most powerful Speaker of the House in United States history. He has been in office for 50 years. He has been the Speaker of the House for 30 years. And in 30 years, not one member has ever voted against him. I just got a text message earlier today. The 11th member of his own caucus is now calling for him to resign. I think there is a high likelihood that Mike Madigan is no longer going to be the Speaker of the House, which is going to get at corruption inside of the state of Illinois. When I look at the future here, I will say we will attack the pension system and we will reform it in the next several years here. Corruption is going to be a thing of the past. And finally, we're going to see a dramatic reduction in union membership. I'll end here and say, I'm going to give you guys a bold prediction. Illinois is not as blue as we think it is, and the wall is crumbling. Illinois is going to turn purple very, very, very fast, and we will turn red in the next few years. And you heard this here first. I'm looking at the numbers. We were within 30,000 votes of flipping the Illinois House from blue to red. There are three. If there was spending parity, Illinois or the United States could have picked up 3 congressional seats out of Illinois. There is 600,000 people who voted for Joe Biden and did not vote on or voted against the progressive tax. This is a very different state than we give it credit for. I think in the same way you see the left attacking Texas, starting with us and the leadership here, the right is going to be attacking the state of Illinois, and we will flip this.
Matt, Tracy mentioned at the beginning that our polling has shown that Americans are a lot more pragmatic than any politician gives them credit for. It sounds like you back that up 100%. Fair? Especially in Illinois.
When you look at the numbers, it's so much closer than we see. This could have been a huge red wave in Illinois. And I think to Tracy's point, we've gotten outspent in every one of these races I just mentioned, 10 to 1 or more. If there was spending parity, this would be an absolute sea of red in the state of Illinois. We will be building the infrastructure and expanding on exactly what Tracy mentioned earlier. We have a C3 that we use for research and for messaging and marketing. We have a C4 that we use for building this huge activist group. We started a ballot committee so we could spend $1 million telling people vote no on this. We have a litigation center. I run a political action committee that gives money to Democrats and Republicans so we can get big things passed. This is the future. And I think with these apparatus, with this infrastructure, we can not only flip a state like Illinois, we can expand this through the rest of the country.
I think Tracy's ready to invite you into California as soon as you're ready to get there.
Well, I'm fascinated by this because, as you know, the affirmative action initiative failed here in California. Yeah. And I watched an interesting post-election analysis of that the other day, and they brought in some of the people who ran the No campaign to defeat this pro-affirmative action initiative. And they ran some terrific ads and had some interviews after the fact with Latino, Asian, and Black voters. And the consistent message was, look, we're not who you think we are, progressives, right? Yeah. We're Americans first. There was also a tremendous ad by a Latino radio talk show host. The essence of the ad was, it's just a very short, it's 30-second ad, but it says, in essence, it says, we can think and act for ourselves. We don't need the government telling us our identity or who we are. And I think those are so in line with the founding principles, right? And I think a lot of these groups are resisting being funneled into a certain identity and are more or less assimilating into the American way of life because they want to flourish, they want to succeed. So I thought it's very instructive. I don't want to rest on our laurels because there's so much work to be done ahead to really continue to expand our audiences. But I dare say you couldn't have got to 1.5 million owned audience if you weren't able to reach into new and different audiences that may not traditionally be with us.
Yes, and I think to that point, what I love about that, Tracy, and I think what I love about what SPN does is you don't accept the premise of impossible, because it's too easy to say the Latino community, the Hispanic community, we can't get into them, or the Black community, they're just sold on the Democratic Party. That's not true. And I think when you meet people where you're at, they move. Yeah. When you educate them and you go into that, I think that there's a gigantic opportunity exactly with what you're saying, targeting different people, because we all want the same ends, but we've often just abandoned them because we thought this is impossible. Just not true. I think Illinois, I think California, these can be in play again.
Right. And I think in the post-election world here, the less we can react and the more we can continue to build relationships, less react, more relationships into these communities. It not only makes us better at our policies, right, into the communities of people we're truly trying to serve. It makes us better at policy. It makes us better communicating that market ideas can alleviate human suffering.
Yes, absolutely.
Very well said. Okay, we're about to move into the Q&A section of the show where the audience has some questions for you guys. If something's come to mind, please ask a question in the chat box or the Q&A box, which is right at the bottom of your screen. A couple folks sent questions before the show, so we'll start there. David Stanley asked, how state governor and legislature wins correlate with the presidential elections, right? So good news in the states, not such great news at the White House. What do you make of that?
I'll start, and then Matt, you're closer to the action there. Yeah, the split ticket phenomena was interesting. I think it's federal versus state and local, right? The presidential are far away in the imperial city on the Potomac, but when we vote for our state and local races, I would think we want to feel like we have more personal agency, right? Like these decisions are going to be made closer to where I live. And I can see more pragmatism, more of that personal priorities coming out in those votes. Whereas perhaps the presidential race was more about who I didn't like or lesser of two evils. I'm not sure. I think a lot of Americans faced a tricky choice there, but overall, voting with our pocketbook and what affects us more personally at the state and local could explain some of that split ticket phenomena. I don't know, Matt, what do you think?
I think you're spot on. I think there's reason to be really excited about this because it shows that people are educated. It's not as binary as we wanted it to be. The fact that people were willing to vote for Joe Biden, but then vote for a Republican governor or a Republican representative, that speaks to a progression of the electorate in the voting population. I mean, also, I want to say, I think this sets us up for a huge opportunity in 2 years. I think it is so ripe. And you see, if the president is Joe Biden, you will see it always goes cross ticket from what he was. I think the fact that we have Congress, which is going to, or excuse me, that we have the United States Senate held, I think the Supreme Court is going to have a bigger impact. It's going to push more and more issues local. And I think that gives all of us from state think tanks huge opportunities to play inside of our states because it gives us more control. I think ultimately, long term, this is going to be a big win for us.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Biden is inheriting gridlock.
Yeah.
Right. And no mandate. So this opens the door for states to come in and solve problems, not about
Yes.
taking sides, right? We solve problems at the state and local level. And let's face it, folks, we got problems ahead, whether it's pandemic related, economic related, healthcare, K-12, there's a lot we need to get at. And being able to solve those in our communities, right? This is where our lives are formed and transformed. And I don't want Joe Biden telling me about my pod, my learning pod for my kids, or how to run my school. We want to solve that locally. So I think the power of subsidiarity is going to help us solve these problems. I'm not saying it's perfect, but
Right.
it's more relevant, responsive, and accountable to the people.
That's right.
Very well said. Well, that brings me to our next question from Ed Johnson. Ed, thanks for joining the show again. And Tracy, you talked about this in your opening questions about the Overton window. And in some ways, it feels like the Overton window is wide open on a variety of issues. And you just talked about a few of them. Ed wants to know over the next 2 years, what are a couple of the core openings here where you see we can really make a difference?
Well, I don't know that we have 2 years. I think we have to strike while the iron's hot. I don't want to make the mistake of moving too slowly because that window could shut. So but in the meantime, when the opportunity exists, I've said, where the window is open, we need to drive a truck through it, right? So especially K-12 education,
Yes.
where more and more parents feel this acutely with their children, it disproportionately affects single parents, the people who are least able to really have these choices. They want more personal agency. They want that empowerment. Healthcare reform, I think expanding telehealth, people are getting much more comfortable and familiar with some of these appointments being done digitally. There's much more that can be done to make some of the temporary reforms permanent. I think on energy, we're going to have to hold the line because the Clean Power Plan will probably come back with a vengeance there. So, but there's a lot states can do to defend on that too. What are you seeing, Matt?
I think education is going to be a huge one. I think we're seeing in Illinois specifically, public schools are shut down. Private schools are open and in person. And we are seeing record numbers of people moving over to those schools. At Chicago Public Schools and CPS, I heard the other day that only 50% of students have logged on. Think about that. What is happening to the poor and disadvantaged people as they're getting farther and further back? And the idea that they all have wireless internet and computers and can log on is such a myth in the disservices that are being done. So I think there's a huge opportunity on education. But I also think that there's a huge opportunity when we talk about teachers' unions.
Yes.
A lot of these teachers aren't happy with what's going on. And I can tell you, the parents are starting the revolution in saying they have to go back to classes. And there's a way that I think that a wedge issue can be popped up here with saying, look, it's the kids want to go back to schools. It's the teachers' union that are preventing this because it's not happening in private schools here. So I think that we can really see some major labor reforms starting to push on this in the next couple of years as well. And like I said, with the state like Illinois, the elephant in the room is the pension system, and it is growing. We have increases over the last 20 years. We have a 500% increase on pension costs. We have a 32% reduction on core services. I think when we can solve this here in Illinois, we can expand this throughout the country, and we are going to see taxes go dramatically down. I think we have huge opportunities here.
Yeah, the pension bomb, that for sure, getting to that. You mentioned something about these decisions to close schools, and it triggered in me another hot button, and that is curbing and holding these governors accountable for some of the emergency powers
Mhm.
decisions and power that they hold that is not being countered or checked by state legislative or judicial oversight. So I think this is where these litigation centers, and I know, Matt, you work with Liberty Justice Center.
Yeah.
There's a litigation center in Michigan and Wisconsin too that have been instrumental in holding their governors accountable. I think
That's right.
in Michigan in particular, the Mackinac Center exposed that it was a 1945 emergency powers law that was ruled unconstitutional. I mean, this has been on the books since 45 and never challenged. And for such a time as this, we need to really rein in the potential tyranny of one person having all this executive power. And that's having these separations of powers is important at the federal level and at the state level.
Very well said. Okay, final question. I want to take you guys back to something Tracy mentioned at the beginning of the show when we started to talk about election integrity. We've got a question from James Fiat, and James, I might have said your last name wrong, but we can talk about that after the show. He wanted to know, what's the solution here? Is it possible to have an election for only the president and vice president with one set of rules to govern that particular election? Maybe something like a paper ballot, because he had some really terrible experiences with electronic ballot. But there's so many ways to skin this cat. How do you even start? Tracy?
Yeah. Well, for sure, the Constitution allows for each state to decide these processes, and some do it better than others. I think Florida learned the hard way in 2000 with the whole hanging Chad debacle, and it took a number of years for them to really dismantle the program, rebuild it into a much more efficient, accountable, and a transparent model that it is today. And I've heard there's a few other states that have done it well. I think being able to elevate best practices and pressure secretaries of state to just face the brutal facts. If their state does not have an efficient model, they owe it. It's their responsibility to the citizens of their state that their vote is counted in an efficient, reliable, transparent, and accountable way. Otherwise, it undermines the entire system and erodes yet another institution, erodes the trust in yet another institution that we rely on.
Matt?
I have nothing to add. I completely agree. This is the underpinning of it's trust, and it's trust in our system. I find the whole thing, Florida is a great example of somebody who had problems with it and address it and fix it. I think the rest of the states need to follow suit. It is completely ridiculous that 2 weeks after the election, we have no idea what's happening in some of these states. Florida fixed this. I think we need to put pressure on our states to say this can't happen in the future, because we cannot erode trust here.
Yeah.
Very well said. Well, Tracy, maybe we'll have a whole other show dedicated to that as time goes on. We'll see how the states pick that up and run with it. So,
Rebecca, I had one more question for Matt.
If I may. You may.
Okay, Matt, I'm inspired by your passion for Illinois, and your vision that this state could go from blue to purple, maybe eventually red. Where does that come from? Where do you find the fire to keep that going, to really keep your eyes focused ahead? Tell us a little bit about that vision.
So my goal always is how do we take innovative solutions to old problems? I mean, any of the problems that we're talking about here today, they're not new. This is not new things that are popping up. I was thinking the other day about Illinois and what we've been able to accomplish in Illinois, right? And we get jokes all the time, like the blue state, look at how bad things are. In Illinois, 3 years ago, we had one of the worst public school systems in the country, right? That's not a new problem. Other states see that. But we went and passed education tax credit scholarships for $75 million. So tens of thousands of kids could go to the school of their choice, not being stuck in the failed school in the south and west side of Chicago. You know, we've had labor union problems for decades. This isn't a new problem.
Yeah.
But we worked with Mark Janus and we sued. And we took it to the United States Supreme Court, providing millions of people freedom from the unions they belong to. You know, progressive tax, a tax structure like this that is intrinsically unfair, 32 other states have this. This is not a new concept, but we took innovative solutions to solving these problems. Why I love this moment in time and I think where we're at right now is that we are all applying innovative solutions to our problems. It is going to turn the industry on its head in the same way that Uber disrupted the cab industry, in the same way that we saw Carfax disrupt used cars. State policy network in all of these individual states are doing exactly that in our states. The revolution is coming and the revolution is here. This was very clear to me what we saw 2 weeks ago on Tuesday. This is just the beginning and this is an exciting time to be a part of a state.
Aha. Okay.
Okay, well, with that,
Yeah.
yeah, on that note, Matt, all I can say is it sounds like from what you said earlier that your passion and your drive has been also instilled in Fiona, your daughter. She's not afraid to slay the dragon. You're
That's
not
right.
afraid to slay the dragon. The viewers on the show who've been giving to SPN and to the think tank community for a number of years has made it possible so that we can go
That's
all
right.
go out there and do it. So those of you watching, thank you. I hope you guys understand that you are the reason we're able to share stories like this. And this is such a big deal at this moment in our nation's history. And I think we're going to see really exciting opportunities ahead. And we're just so glad to partner with you as we keep moving forward. So thank you for everything you've done this year and in years past. We really appreciate you. We will have another show in December. I think it's going to be a good one, but I can't announce it quite yet. So keep an eye out in your email for that topic. And please, just a reminder, if you like the show and you want to invite friends, the more the merrier. So please feel free to forward the link. And we will see you in December for our next show. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Matt. And everybody have a great rest of your week.
Happy Thanksgiving next week.
Thank you.